Welcome to our webinar about the post-COVID recovery programs, the US and EU strategies to jumpstart their economies and make them fit for the future. This event is organized by the European American Chamber of Commerce, New York. My name is Yvonne Bendinger-Rothschild. I'm the Executive Director of the EACC, and I will be your host for today's event. To make this program interactive, I encourage our audience members to ask questions. We will submit them to the panel throughout the program. About our program, we have seen some differences and similarities between the EU and US approach to their COVID rescue packages, and the post-pandemic recovery is no different. The EU is looking to seize the moment to implement a comprehensive industrial strategy in line with the Green Deal and digitalization strategies that the Commission launched before the pandemic, and the US is using the opportunity to launch a major infrastructure plan, one that, unlike prior ones, addresses a number of social issues that are part of the so-called soft infrastructure. Our panel will enlighten us on what you need to know on both plans and how you can get involved. Our speakers include Kerstin Jorna. She's the Director General of the DG for Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship and SMEs at the European Commission. Prior to that, she was the Deputy Director of the DG Economic and Financial Affairs and the Director for Single Market Policy. We also have on the panel Tom Barrett, who is the Chairman of the OECD Infrastructure Governance Forum. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in DC. And Tom was the US representative of the EIB in Washington, which is a member of the EACC. We also have Angelo Ubide. He's the Managing Director at Citadel. Prior to joining Citadel, he was the Managing Director within the Investment Strategy Group at Goldman Sachs. And he began his career as an economist at the IMF. I think this is when we met back then. We have Simon Wells. He's the Chief European Economist at HSBC Bank. He joined the bank as the Chief UK Economist in 2011, and following a long career at the Bank of England, where he held a number of roles in monetary policy, financial stability, and markets. Our moderator today is Rolf Alter. He's an economist and fellow at the Heritage School of Governance. Rolf spent 25 years at the OECD in Paris, and in 2006 he was appointed to the Chief of Staff of the OECD Secretary General, and he became the Director of Public Governments in 2009 and built a team to support governments, improving public sector performance for sustainable development, and to help improve their competitiveness, the competitiveness of their economies, which in our view made him the perfect moderator for this. Rolf, I hand over to you. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Yvonne. Thank you all for participating in this panel, and all the people who have took the time to tune in. In the last month, the OECD, in its annual, but now it's nearly a quarterly outlook on the economy, said that we are in a brightening spot for the global economy, for the industrialized world, of course, some emerging markets very much so. And they were saying this is basically due to three reasons. The one is simply that thanks to the vaccination, 2 billion doses of vaccine have been administered in the world. 2 billion, quite a number. Not perhaps enough, but quite a number. But second, due to a really unprecedented and a very well tuned in package of health, fiscal, monetary, and if you like, industrial policy, which led to maintaining the economic fabric, jobs and firms for more than a year and a half. Our program today, dealing with these recovery programs in the US and the European Union are certainly part of this assessment, this very positive assessment. And watching the news, especially on the US side, most recently, there seems to be enormous movement in making sure that enough resources will be deployed not only this year, but over a long period of years to come. So what we want to do today is, where are we really exactly with these programs? The EU, which sort of started early on it in many ways, the Americans with the job plan, the recovery package, and now with 2 or 3, I'm not quite sure anymore how to count them, programs to build further involvement and support for the recovery. But I have to say, there was also, yeah, of course, there was also something about the headwinds that are still there and may hamper the recovery globally. And the first is for sure still the issue of the pandemic, and the outbreaks that we can see are just an indication for what is still ahead of us, even in cases where it is not a question of missing vaccine doses. There is also the risk of higher inflation that's being considered as being very serious. And we have already seen trade bottlenecks, difficulties to ensure that the recovery has enough access to inputs, materials, but also really commodities and so on. So the question is, what is it sort of really be the headwinds that will take over, or will it be really these very massive investments of government? And that brings me to my last point that I would like to add. There are 2 issues that I really struggle with. The one is, never we have seen this type of enormous role of government in managing the economy. I think even 2008 and 9 were not of that size. Are the governments up to the job? And I don't mean by that, can they spend enough? But the question is, do they have the regulations in place, the planning in place to run, for example, these massive infrastructure programs? And what will governments do in terms of making sure that the private sector joins them and will really invest, will take part in procurement processes, because I'm sure that will still be the case. And the second point that I want to make in this idea about what's the role of government, good economic policy needs confidence, trust in government. Otherwise, it will not work very efficiently. Are governments commanding that type of trust? In the US, where the country is still divided, and in Europe, when you look at individual countries, major countries like the Germans, the French, Italians, each of them has a bit of an individual big change ahead. For the Germans, is leaving Mrs. Merkel. For France, especially after the weekend, the elections may be less clear next year for the president than it looked like. And the Italians are going to a major crisis. So the issue here is, governments seem to be willing to spend, put it in place, but will they be having also the context in which these programs will work? I think for business people, this would be a particular relevant concern. May I ask, Kerstin, to start with you and sort of give us a bit of an idea, really, where is this Recovery and Resilience Fund today, and what you think will be sort of the immediate implications for investment to come?
Okay, thank you very much. In short, it's resources meeting project pipelines, because we will be judged, any government will be judged on the impact, how we walk the talk on the ground. And what I'd like to present, to use my little 5 minutes here, is to present our plan. I mean, how we want to go about it. And it's important to have a lot of money. I just mentioned the number, 750 billion plus the EU budget, so we can add up. But I don't think that's the point. The point is really, how do we get to invest that? Not only spend it, but to get into an investment logic. Maybe I just give you where we come from, because when we drew up the plan and this initiative, we came from a situation with 3 identifying factors, which I think also are true for the US. The first is COVID, this experience of a total pandemic health crisis, and the fact that government had to organize this, and we all struggled in the beginning, you in the US for different reasons than we in the EU, but in the end we got there and we managed. And I think that's part of what you call the confidence, we call it the light at the end of the tunnel, the confidence that we see across all industrial ecosystems in Europe at the moment. Just for Europe, you know, in January, we started with 25 million doses of vaccines. I mean, we all congratulated ourselves that amongst the almost 200 projects for vaccines, we had identified the 6 that actually will probably make it all to regulatory approval. But then the awakening was that didn't mean we had the vaccines, because you need to produce them, you need to fill and finish them. And that's when our task force for industrial ramp-up was created. We today have almost 60 companies that actually produce vaccines and continuous flow. We produce close to 300 million doses a month now. Remember, we come from 25 in 6 months. That's an enormous scale up. And why it worked was because of a real, very close cooperation between the public, who didn't know, I mean, my team, in fact, we didn't know a lot about, you know, the vaccine value chain, but we learned it and we troubleshooted where we could by matchmaking, bringing partners together, finding these filters, finding the nanolipids that and the production, finding fill and finish, building up, helping to build up very quickly, helping the vaccine producers also with our advanced purchasing agreement. We had no template for all of this. We did it, and you know, we had to learn while walking, but we managed. So that's the experience from the COVID. What we also experienced is that, hey, when the pandemic broke, where are these masks? Where are the ventilators? Where are the gloves? We couldn't have imagined. Nobody had imagined that we might be lacking these. So again, we had to find solutions how to go about it. I mean, we common purchases for all the member states together, for switching production lines with certain companies who no longer produce T-shirts but masks, or car suppliers producing ventilators or spare parts for ventilators rather than machines. What do we do with the standards? The market surveillance had to be built around it. Again, no template, but government walked in. So that's first experience, why we thought that kind of it's very deeply seated in the way we draft our plans. Second was the climate ambition. We now have a climate law which says that we have to do minus 55 CO2 emissions by 2030. Very clear target. I'll say a word about that, but you know, that was an enhanced ambition compared to what we had before. And then the third is the geopolitical. We see positioning we had border restrictions, and we understand that Europe and the single market have to maintain their position also for the future. So that's where we come from. Now, what and how? The plan, as I said, is the money. We have it now, and we're going to the market. By the way, going to the market for 750 billion for the EU actually issuing bonds means that just on passing, we were able to set a new global standard for social bonds. because part of that money is social bonds. We also manage and we will be setting standard green bonds. We will be the biggest green bond issuer globally, and we also have an earmarking in these 750 billion for the member states who are investing it, 37% green and 20% digital. But that does not create a project pipeline in itself. So now I get to the industry strategy, the updated industry strategy, which looks at three issues in particular. The single market. We need to fix a number of things to make it ready to react in the next pandemic, to have a crisis protocol, which we didn't have, to take up the learnings, the lessons that we learned, including that export restrictions are the most stupid thing you can do because you block certain goods and essential requirements where they are not needed. But also, if as a government we want, for example, to procure together, we need to know how much. And the companies, they asked us, how much masks do you want? Okay, I switch my production and how much do you want? And we found that as a government and member states government, we were not able really to establish how much we needed, which was, of course, a problem. So we have to improve that, how we get the information. And then we also have to improve how we share scientific advice and how we integrate that into our policy making learnings. The second point in our plan was supply chains. I already mentioned the awakening. Now we made an exercise a bit similar like in the US on looking at our vulnerabilities for supply chains, and that was a triple exercise. The first type of exercise was bottom up, and we were looking at the 5,000 odd products that were imported into the EU. We looked at the ones where we have very little diversification, close to none, and no domestic production, and we came to something like 140 products that are where we are not only dependent very heavily, but which are also concerning sectors which are relevant for green and digital transformation, for security and health. And we're now looking how to follow on from that. The other angle was top down. What are the capabilities that we see that we need? Batteries, hydrogen, for example, active ingredients for pharmaceuticals. And the third angle was to look forward, what's in the future? And that takes us to the microprocessors. And we're now looking, and I had an interesting discussion with Peter Harrell yesterday in a conference. We're now looking at how we can work together because there are joint dependencies. The US and we both have an issue with rare earth, which are not only found and mined in China, 90%, but also processed, separated. So is there something we can do together to look at this? And the third pillar of our industrial strategy is the green business case, because, in order to have that transformation, you need to have a business case, because no money, public money in the world would be enough to power that green transition. You also need to have private money come in, and that means you need a business and investment case. Now, here we're looking at energy need. How much decarbonized energy do we actually need? Now, and then we also look at alternative fuels like hydrogen. Just a word on hydrogen. The problem with hydrogen is that those who could invest in electrolyzers, they don't, because they say, we don't know if there will be a market for this. And those who could use the hydrogen, like the steel companies or cement, they say, we don't invest because we don't know if there's enough hydrogen. Now, what we did, we brought and the two actually have a third problem, which is how do you get the hydrogen from where you produce it, wind and sun, to the factory gate, storage and transport. We created an alliance. It's more than 1,000 participants in this hydrogen alliance to kickstart the whole hydrogen value chain immediately, from the production to the use. We had a call proposed, and that's the pipeline, the project pipeline I'm mentioning. And we have 900 plus proposals now, which we are kind of matching, putting together, making sure that we have also a regional spread. And if you look at the projects, they cover the whole of Europe for these different elements of the hydrogen value chain. So here we have a project pipeline. And if you look at the plans that member states had to submit in order to be able to benefit from the 750 billion facility, you see that, you know, a lot of them actually foresee investments in hydrogen. So here the investment meets the project pipeline. Battery is another example. We were nowhere on batteries, was all in China. In 2017, we built an alliance, which is now worth 100 billion of investments. We'll probably produce more batteries than we can actually use in Europe within a period of 3 years, because we had, again, the same approach from cover the whole battery value chain, and make sure that supply and demand are matched, and that attracted the investments. So now, how do we do this? I already said there is the budget. This budget is important. It ranges from 0.15% of GDP for some countries to 13% of GDP. I mean, the equivalent for others is very important. We also have this, which is our new lens, the 14 industrial ecosystems, which kind of really irrigate the EU economy, textiles, electronics, mobility, energy-intensive industry. And we will be developing transition pathways in a kind of co-creation fashion with all the stakeholders, companies, big, small, research, tech, SMEs, workers, for the transformation, for the transition in these different ecosystems. Again, this will trigger project pipelines, which can be connected to what member states are planning to spend. We have for almost each ecosystem a blueprint for skills, because we need a skills update, and it's not enough for people to go to school and then, you know, then nothing happens. With this transformation, we will also need skills transformation, which costs a lot of money. And again, the problem was that we had supply, but it didn't meet the demand. So we brought the two sides together to identify what skill demand for the future and how to pay for this. Access to finance, I already said that it's not enough to have public money, you also need the private money to come in. The private money comes in when there are good projects. So again, I come back to the project pipeline that we are creating, also with other alliances, the Microprocessor Alliance, a Low Carbon Alliance, Plastics Alliance. And but we are also creating visibility, and that's the taxonomy. Maybe we will discuss this as well. But this is what we see as the emerging gold standard, actually, for green and sustainable investment. And then, of course,
Excuse me. Could we perhaps, I'm sure we will get back to a few of these questions rapidly, but you know what I wanted to make sure is that we use our time also a bit in the sense that we have a few questions about what it is all about. But let me just make one comment, Kerstin. I mean, the point is that I feel, at least when I listen to you, that we have really an incredible role for government, and in this case, even for the Commission, in managing this process. And we'll come back to it. My question would be here, is there really enough support for such an important role for the Commission? Because that, I think, is a part of your success story, that there will be enough support and continuing support for these many, many years to come when the program runs. For the time being, could I just sort of move and invite perhaps Angel, if you could say something from the US point of view. And you know, really struck by the many, many news of announcing programs. And then, of course, there are little linkages created between, well, you know, our infrastructure program will only work if we get the second bid that I understand that President Biden says. And then others come in and say, no, but it's not the right thing. And Mr. Sanders is drawing up another plan of a 6 trillion. So money seems to be no longer an issue anywhere, although I looked at it, the US is by now by more than 110% of debt per GDP. So I'm just trying to understand, are these really all additional programs, or are they more or less one big issue, but sliced so that it's politically more feasible to digest and manage? Okay.
Thank you. And let me start by congratulating Kerstin and her colleagues on what I think has been a fantastic response in Europe to the pandemic. So all I can say is, you know, keep it up, if that's the right word. Now, thinking about the US, and I think also this applies to Europe, right? I just want to make 2 points. They're more macro, but I think they basically provide the backdrop to everything that has been done. The first one, as you were suggesting, this is not only possible because interest rates are low, it is needed because interest rates are too low. And I think those two things are important, right? The first one is there has been a secular decline in what we economists call neutral interest rates, essentially driven by demographics and many other factors. And this has created more fiscal space. And the key is that now we need to use that fiscal space in a smart manner. And the way to use the fiscal space in a smart manner is with programs like the infrastructure programs we are talking about, but also the vaccination campaigns and others that are going to boost potential growth in the future. Because if they boost potential growth in the future, basically de facto they pay for themselves. So at the end of the day, it's not a question of whether debt levels are high or low. It's a question of the quality of the spending and what you do with that issuance and with that money, right? And I think in that regard, what the European Commission and the Next Gen and the European leaders have done is essentially try to delineate what are the uses of money that are good, quote unquote. And there, I just want to raise a question, which is the following. Of course, the focus has been on green and on digital. And my only worry is whether social issues are going to be left out, right? And I'm not saying they will, but I'm raising a question mark here. And I'm linking this, in fact, to what is happening in the US. As you know, President Biden has presented two proposals for infrastructure. One is physical infrastructure, and the other one is what they call social infrastructure, right? Because at the end of the day, I can make the same argument that building bridges and improving highways improves potential growth. And I can make a similar argument that is to reduce inequality, improve education at the lower end of the income distribution, and reducing poverty also improves potential growth. And so it is a question, I think, of considering for each economy in particular, what is the bottleneck, right? What is really the impediment to growth? And that might be different across countries. It might be different inside the European Union, right? It's not clear to me that the needs of a country like Germany are the same thing as the needs of a country like, pick another one, Portugal, Spain, my home country, any other, right? And so I think we need to be open-minded in defining infrastructure as clearing the bottlenecks more than specifically it can only be this sector, that sector, or that sector. And if we do that, then I think we can have several years of very prosperous growth ahead. I will just leave you with one question for Kerstin and for the others. That is, a lot of these programs are being defined. For example, if we think about green with the climate objective in mind, we want to reduce emissions by so much by the end of 2030, for example. And so my question is, can this be done? In other words, do we have enough commodities that are needed in order to generate those investments? And is there going to be enough fiscal support for those who are being affected by those investments, right? In the sense that green energy is more expensive than dirty energy. So there needs to be a complementary fiscal support to those who are going to be on the other side of this effort. And I hope that that is being taken into consideration, because otherwise, we run the risk of a backlash in a few years of people complaining, green energy and electric cars are just too expensive. I'll just leave it with that, and thank you.
Great, good questions, and we'll pass it on right here to Tom, who will say something, hopefully, a few comments on what we knew and what we know until today for the US program on infrastructure, which looked as if it was a standalone program, but it doesn't seem to be quite the case any longer. But nevertheless, there are some very interesting numbers for the investment areas. Tom, does that fit this broad spectrum?
Indeed. Let me take up the question that Angel raised a few moments ago as to whether this can be done, i.e. these broad strategic objectives, and link it indeed to your own opening remark about whether the spending can be delivered, can deliver the results. Now, I come from, shall we say, the optimistic side of the world population in believing that many things can be done, even if they have not been done previously. But let's also be very pragmatic. When we look at the European, or indeed the analogous US programs on infrastructure, on green, on digital, all of these things, these are an integral part of the overall Sustainable Development Goals that were set by the UN. If we are to be frank with ourselves, as the Secretary General was frank at the last annual meeting, he is saying very clearly, we are way, way behind on delivery. We're clear as to what the headlines are. What we have difficulty with is actually working out what is required to deliver. Now, the European Union has a marvelous history of having set very ambitious objectives and very frequently meeting those objectives. But we have, even on areas within our own domain, like the Lisbon Agenda of 2000, we have really found that delivering multifactorial, multi-objective programs is really very, very tough. And it gets particularly tough when the amount of money involved creates such a momentum, such a willingness to spend, that how it is being spent and the results it is achieving becomes a secondary consideration. So we can make a number of comments about both the situation in the US and in Europe generally, but in fact, this type of comment applies globally. The infrastructure investment gap is substantial. We have not, if we look at what we think to be normative levels, been investing at all to the degree we need. We know in many cases the absence of essential services. We know all of these things. And yet, somehow or other, we have not been able to bridge the gap between the availability of surplus savings and the type of secular stagnation that Angel was referring to, with the need to deliver public policy objectives. So our big challenge is indeed, how can we spend better? And, when we look back at the recent crises of the last 10 or 20 years, we know that in order to exit the crisis, the focus must really be on a strategic vision, a guiding light that enables us to sort out many of the secondary and tertiary issues. Now, governance is one of those guiding lights. And I was pleased in a very positive way to see that the G20 over the last number of years has hammered out, with the support both of US administrations of the time, but particularly of the European administrations, a support program for quality infrastructure investment. Now, that really took a strategic medium to long-term view as to what core objectives should be, that these investments had got to be economically sustainable, because otherwise the massive funding we were putting into these would have two negative effects. It would do damage to the economy, and even more seriously, it would damage political credibility. And that, when lost, can be rebuilt, but it can take a tremendously long time. So just looking through, for example, Conference Board policy guidelines for the new infrastructure investment program in the US, it is comforting to see that their type of focus, in fact, could well be translated immediately into European concerns. They don't state the sectoral objectives in quite the same way that Europe has and does, but in terms of the economic methodology and justification, they are saying essentially the same things. Now, let me finish with one point at this stage. One of the key things that has made a difference in the initial response to the COVID pandemic, in a way that we did not have to the same degree in 2008 with the great financial crisis, was the degree of joined up government response, both at national and at international level. So the capacity of governments on this occasion to join fiscal instruments with monetary, with investment, with direct programs such as Kirsten has been describing, has been remarkably more active on this occasion. But, you know, when we hear Kirsten go through the different degrees, the different levels of complexity, we see that this is the most enormous effort and will continue to be required and will continue to require enormous effort over many years to come. So, in essence, I think people have taken on board that the key problem is how to spend better to achieve our strategic objectives. The actual numerical value of some of these programs is, to be frank, much less important at this stage until we get the basics right.
Yeah, Tom, the call for quality spending certainly we will need, and we will hear it a lot, I'm sure, in the next while, especially, I think especially because there are enormous amounts of money involved. And I would like to go to Simon and say, I mean, you know, even today, you see in this discussion as well, we don't seem to really have any consideration for the fiscal dimension of this future packages that are coming our way. When you look at the situation, just take 2 years, I mean, 1.5 years ago, you know, there were countries that would believe that balanced budget was a must. But there were countries that have been in the European Union and were told what to do, what the limits were, what reasonable government would do. And now we're hearing something that says, please, yes, that's not really too much of an issue. So when I look at it, what does it mean for business? I mean, Kerstin was referring to the questions that are so long-term and so multi-linked that it's not so easy to say, should I invest or not? But everybody, I am sure, will be worried about if every government were now indebted enormously and someone must, or maybe that's the assumption, must finance it at some point. So where do you see this discussion about the debt levels move to? I really think we need not to forget that. Please, Simon, if you want to say some things from your experience.
Certainly. I mean, I think it's we shouldn't forget that to some extent, even today, policymakers face some kind of trade-off between support today and the benefits that brings versus the potential costs, whether that be through debt, unintended consequences, zombie companies, all those potential costs that come through tomorrow. And so far, that trade-off has been a relatively straightforward one, with, as you say, all governments pulling in the same direction. It's an optimistic assessment to say that some of those governments, I can't imagine who you're referring to about wanting to run balanced budgets at all times, will move away from that. May well depend on the coalition makeup that we have after next September, but I still think, and you see it from many German politicians in the run-up to the election, that the idea of a serious fiscal loosening and constitutional change in Germany may be some way off. But so far, with everything pulling together in the same direction, something quite remarkable has happened. If you look at HSBC's forecasts for the Eurozone, by the end of next year, the amount of permanent scarring, lost output, is tiny, with 0.4% of GDP. If you look at, say, the ECB's mild scenario, its upside scenario from the June forecast, GDP in 2023 is above its pre-pandemic trend. Something has happened here. It's rather odd to say that in some sense the pandemic has been good for growth, and yet that is what is happening in the forecasts. And it's quite clear that the NGEU, whether we get fixated on the amounts, and I think 750 billion is the wrong amount, not all the loans are being taken. Presumably some of the loans that are being taken will have displaced domestic borrowing that would have happened anyway. But if we look at the 313 billion or so of grants, that could be new spending, plus the REACT-EU money, that's 2.5% of GDP over 6 years being invested. Now, it might be tiny compared to what's being pledged in the US, but it's still meaningful. That's point one. It's also because of the way European fiscal stabilizers work, it's not fair to compare the amounts because a lot of the stabilization stuff in the US would have happened in Europe. But just one final point. This money isn't being shared equally. If this investment produces a 0.2 uplift in Italian trend growth, when Italian trend growth might be 0.5, this is still serious. This is still serious stuff. It's good high multiplier investment, and particularly with the reforms that come with the Recovery and Resilience Plan, if they can be enacted, not only do we boost trend growth by capital deepening, we might boost total factor productivity as well, the efficiency in which capital and labor is combined, and that would have immense benefit, particularly combined with the industrial strategy and its focus on SMEs for some of the periphery economies, and help narrow that productivity gap. So yes, quality matters, as Thomas was saying. Going back to what Angel said, we have to, in order for this all to be sustainable, it has to be supply side, sustainable growth, not just throwing money at the problem, boosting demand and borrowing from the future. And cautiously optimistic, but Europe still faces a lot of structural challenges, poor demographics, rigid labor markets, the political hurdles. We shouldn't underestimate those hurdles too.
Great, thank you very much. Could I take this again, Kerstin, back to you in another sense? I mean, you were speaking about these very important new financing mechanisms that, after all, the Commission has now at its hands, which didn't exist the same way. And that in itself is probably a major progress, I have to say, in terms of giving the Commission another type of role and another potential for intervention. But could you comment, please, on this relationship between what's happening in the member countries of the European Union? There you have very different very often additional measures that are managed under the national authority. Is there sufficient coordination between what's happening in the member countries on their own turf, sort of, with what the Commission is doing to manage this new fund?
Two comments on this. The first is between spending and investment. We've moved away from the logic of spending, which is, you know, I'm the finance minister, I have to get rid of my money logic. And we're moving into our discussions into an investment, you know, what creates the future logic. And that's what we tried to do in the regulation that allows this resilience and a recovery and resilience facility to be used. I also want to say, and that's my second point, that we've moved away from the government has to do this or the Commission has to do it. We have a much more collaborative approach to how we got out of the crisis or how we get out of the crisis and how we manage that twin transition and how we make our economy more resilient. It starts with the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which is on the Next Generation EU, where member states submit plans, where all member states, the legislator together actually sets down benchmarks. How do we want on the quality of investment? Where member states themselves in an internal process draft these plans and submit them, where the Commission kind of gives an opinion on these plans, and we've kind of given an opinion on half of them, and where it goes to the Council and the Parliament to assess these plans and also see and make sure that there is a coherence. And then member states go back, I mean, and we've already transferred some money to member states, but they have to spend against the milestones they agreed before. And if they don't spend on the projects and the reforms they have against the milestones, then we will not be able to spend or to transfer the money. So there is a collaborative mechanic which we did not have in this way before, because we had EU money, we had national money, and the EU money was often, I mean, either we gave it directly to beneficiaries, like on our research budget, or we gave it, which is the shared management, to member states, but then it was the member states doing it. So this is a very new quality of making sure that we get the investment right and to deliver. The other point on the collaborative is what I mentioned, the industrial policy and the pathways. We don't know, obviously, you know, on certain value chains. We need the private and the companies to come in and tell us. And we need to ask each other questions. I chaired this morning our industrial forum with, you know, more than 100 representatives from industry, where we decided how we are going to work together on these transition pathways and how we make sure that the transformation works, which may mean, in some cases, you know, take magnets. If we want to have renewable energy, which we need to produce this hydrogen and to allow the decarbonization of our industry, we need magnets. We don't have magnets. Where are they? So they are in China, 90%. And they are in China because the rare earth is in China, because the mining is in China, because the processing is in China, because the separation is in China, because the producing of magnets is in China. Okay, that's a problem, because if we don't have access to these magnets, and remember the Chinese law recently passed, being able to block the exportations, what do we do? So that started a reflection. What do we do about magnets? And by the way, also in the United States, do we, I mean, we don't have a lot of these rare earths, but we have some. We have a lot of, you know, like my iPad, waste that contains these rare, so urban mining is a possibility. We also have from the current mining waste, where we dug up coal or bauxite, we can extract. So there is plenty of possibilities, but then we also have to build these refining and separation facilities where again the member states can come in. And there are a number of member states who actually in their plans provide, and for your country, Spain and Portugal together are going to build lithium extraction and refining under both their plans. So the convening hub role or moderator role that the government plays much more than I tell you what to do role, will make sure, I'm confident, that we get it right, because we will also be able to correct in the process. And last point, sorry, the third is on the social. I want to say something on the social. One of the main points this morning in our industrial forum was about the social KPIs. And we have trade unions also in associations and in this industrial forum. And they said, it's not about paying, people for losing out. It's really about making sure that all the workers, all the employees down to a company are part of this change and part of these discussions about how to transform the business model or the products, and how to be able to also afford these new products later. And we have, so it's not only about compensation, it's also about, giving new perspectives also to workers. Another area where we discuss this is the mining. So we have to stop mining coal. Okay, but if you look at the geography of Europe and the map where you find the coal today, you find a number of very relevant other raw materials that we would need much more as we move forward, in particular in decarbonization. So mining know-how can move in the same region, that way, Rolf, can move to these new kind of precision mining for other materials. So there is not a single one solution, but because of having this moderating rule, all these elements come in, and I'm very confident actually that together with the industry, with the government, we will be able to make sure that it's quality investment, not only spending.
Thank you very much, Kerstin. Just one little question that may interest someone who is not in the European Union, an investor or a company that produces something. I assume, and I'm sure that you will confirm, that of course all these discussions are open to our American friends as well when they want to be participating.
They are participating, and we now have a new super platform, which is the Tech and Trade Council with 10 working groups, where we will, for example, there's one on clean tech, there's one on standards, the standards that we need for future technologies and maybe raw materials, on supply chains. So we have a very close, as a result of the summit, of the EU-US summit, a dedicated platform to do all this.
Thank you very much. Well, I have a little time, but I wanted to make sure that we have perhaps one sort of a last question really remaining. There seemed to be wide agreement on, yes, it is about the quality of spending, and yes, it will take new mechanisms to make it happen. And yes, let's say there is still some work to be done to make these mechanisms work properly so that they deliver what was intended. Delivery, I heard, is a really key concept. If you think now in terms of the discussions that are still on programs, on different programs, but when you think out also about the risks that we still face, they may be nothing to do with the economics, they may have nothing to do with the financial areas, but they may have simply to do with the fact that, 70% of the people are not vaccinated yet, and that means there is a permanent risk to break down somewhere. What would it be, in your view, if I could have sort of the famous minute, what is it that you recommend governments to do these days? Who would like to start? Tom, you're looking very determined.
I think you've posed a very difficult question. Yeah. And
the simple ones we don't need.
I think the progress we have made should not be underestimated. Now, clearly, there has been almost a crisis of confidence in the public health system, and indeed in some of our ways of managing the public health system. But the progress made through the introduction of the vaccines, through the collaboration on research, all of these things were significant achievements in comparison to what we previously were able to do. That said, we're looking at parts of the world that have less than 1% vaccination. We just cannot get to grips with this as yet. But I think if I may just borrow some of the language and ideas that Kirsten has relayed in what she was talking about. This willingness to bring companies together, to form alliances at a sector level, to form public-private partnerships such as we have in COVAX, such as we have in Gavi and all of these type of things. These are all the things that we must do, and we must do with incredible speed. But the other thing that is very evident is public confidence is perhaps more shaky. It is not fundamentally volatile, but it is certainly in need of reassurance. So for governments to deliver on the ground through the medical service, and let us give the medical service credit, they have shown themselves to be capable of delivering quickly at a scale that, had we asked them 5 years ago, they would have said could never have been done. We should take some comfort in the fact that they are indeed much more flexible than we ever imagined they were. So I think we have a number of positives, but my goodness, we really, when we look at the world outside the immediate OECD quarter, and even within some countries in the OECD, we really are looking at the most gigantic problems that assuredly are going to be with us for a number of years.
Thank you.
Can I add something? I just want to,
Please.
reinforce that and maybe go back to one of the points that I made. That is, I fully agree that the private sector has to be involved, and definitely, we have changed this mindset from spending to investment and all that. But the greening of the economy over the next 10 years is a massive structural change, which to me is equivalent to the opening of global trade, or to the creation of the European Union, if you want, right? When Spain joined the European Union, we were told, you join the European Union, but your steel and coal industry is going to have to disappear. There is a trade-off, and there was money involved. And so the only thing that I would say is that if we want to preserve the trust in governments, we have to make sure that this green transition is done in a way that those who are not going to benefit from it are taken care of. In the same way that the reopening of global trade maybe was done a little bit too much on one side and not in a balanced way. And I think with that, then we are in good shape. It's just a question of, when the bill comes in the budget next year for whatever country that is, you need to do a little bit of subsidies or support here. Let's not say, well, I cannot afford that. But say that's also an investment, is part of the investment into the process. That's it.
Thank you, Simon, sorry.
Simon will do. Yeah, I mean, just picking up on that, I agree with that. I think two of the things that have encumbered the developed world over the post-financial crisis period is debt and the distribution of income. And the pandemic has increased debt and widened the distribution of income. And so following on, I think those are lessons that, those are considerations policymakers have to factor in a lot over the coming years.
Thanks a lot. Kirsten, we started with you. Yours, your final view, please.
I don't know. I mean, I am a policymaker. Should I give an advice to myself? What I want to say is the only battle you lose for sure is the one you don't start, and you have to try. And you can be pessimistic, you can be optimistic, but I think what we are in Europe is determined to bring everybody into this and make sure that this is not only bouncing back but bouncing forward after the pandemic for everyone. And it's I see the situation as a once in a generation opportunity to think differently, act differently, and government is super important in this. Not that we have to do all of this, the opposite, that we make sure that everybody has ownership in this process.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. We give it back to Yvonne with the best message that I can think of, We're all invited to be part of the process. Yvonne, please.
Thank you, everybody. And yeah, I agree with the sentiment that the panel had. These packages are, I mean, I don't want to say a once in a lifetime, but definitely have all the potential to be transformative. And the EACC will definitely try to do our part to bring the private sector into this incredible opportunity on both sides of the Atlantic, because I agree with what Angel just said. It's we are in this together, and we you know, we need to work together on making it happen. And with that, this concludes the discussion today. I mean, this will be ongoing in a different forum, and we will have updates how the packages are implemented, and also, again, on more detailed information how U.S. investors can get involved. We've already seen tremendous interest from European investors in U.S. projects, especially on the green side, because European companies have, you know, years of experience on green transformation, and they're trying to get involved in the U.S. We also have U.S. companies looking for partners in Europe. So this is already happening, and we will monitor how this goes forward. And EACC, we are back in the office, so we're going to return to in-person programs. And I was actually hoping that, you know, Kerstin, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Maybe we can do an update in person in September, you know, or in October, you know, I mean, think about it. I think it could be an interesting discussion. We could repeat this with the exact same panel and then see, you know, have like a status update. I'm throwing this out there. Let us know if you want to do that. And thank you again for everybody, and to be continued, this topic.